The wheat was ready to die. Not in the poetic sense, not in the way farmers speak of a harvest waiting to be taken. No, the wheat in Reno County, Kansas in the August of 1978 was actually dying. Stem rust had been spotted 3 counties east. A weather front was building over the Oklahoma panhandle, and the grain elevator in Hutchinson had already warned its contract farmers, "Get it in by Friday or we start talking about penalties." It was Tuesday morning, and the only machine on Earl Dunnigan's 412 acres that was capable of cutting that wheat, a 1972 Gleaner Model K combine, serial number K31847, painted the color of burnt tangerine, would not start. 3 engineers had tried. One had driven 2 hours from Wichita. Another had been flown in at considerable expense from Allis-Chalmers' regional office in Topeka. The third was a young man with a clipboard and a state agricultural degree who had stood in that field for 45 minutes, made 17 notes, and then quietly walked back to his truck without saying a word. The wheat kept dying. And Earl Dunnigan, 63 years old, with a left knee that had been wrong since a tractor rollover in 1961, and hands so calloused they could have sanded a barn door, stood at the edge of his field and watched all of it happen. He hadn't said much. He never did. Let me tell you about Reno County, Kansas, in the summer of 1978, because if you've never stood in a Kansas wheat field in August, you have missed something that belongs on the short list of this country's most humbling experiences. The sky there is not a ceiling. It is a statement. It stretches from one edge of the world to the other without apology, and in August, under a heat index that could push past 104 degrees before noon, it turns a particular shade of white blue that farmers learn to read the way sailors read water. That color, that particular bleached out haze sitting low on the horizon, that means the pressure is building. That means time is short. The wheat that summer, winter wheat, planted the previous October, now golden and heavy and bending slightly in a southwest wind, had come in extraordinary. Reno County extension agents were already talking about yield numbers that hadn't been seen since before the '74 drought. The grain was fat. The protein content was high. The Hutchinson elevator was paying $2.96 a bushel, and for a man running 400 acres without debt on the equipment, or so he'd managed to keep it, that kind of harvest could mean the difference between a year that merely survived and a year that actually breathed. Earl Dunnigan's farm sat 7 miles southeast of the town of Nickerson, down a gravel county road the locals called Spinner Road, though it appeared on no official map by that name. The farmstead itself, a white 2-story house built in 1923, a wooden machine shed painted the same barn red it had always been, a corrugated steel grain bin that Earl had put up himself in 1969, sat in the middle of his acreage like a small civilization. Everything about it was functional, nothing about it was new. The combine, that Gleaner K, had been Earl's since 1974, purchased used from a retiring farmer over in Kingman County for $11,000 cash. Not a loan, cash. Money Earl had saved over 3 years of custom combining work for neighbors, running a borrowed machine on weekends in addition to his own operation. $11,000 represented, at that time, something close to a religious act of commitment to a particular way of farming. The Gleaner K was not a glamorous machine. It was not the flashy thing. The John Deere 6600 was the glamorous machine. That's what the dealers pushed. That's what the newer farmers bought on credit and talked about at the co-op. The Gleaner K was quieter, older in its design philosophy, and deeply misunderstood by men who judged agricultural equipment the way some people judge restaurants, by how it looked from the parking lot. But it was Tuesday morning, and the Gleaner K would not start, and the wheat was waiting, and the engineers had gone. Earl Dunnigan was not the kind of man who announced himself. He was born in 1915, the third of 5 children, on a dryland farm outside of Pratt, Kansas, 40 miles southwest of where he'd spend the rest of his working life. His father, Clarence Dunnigan, had farmed through the tail end of the Dust Bowl years with a stubbornness that passed in that family for optimism. Earl had driven a tractor for the first time at age 9. By 12, he was disking his father's fields alone. By 14, during the worst of the Depression, he'd spent a summer driving a combine for a neighbor in Nebraska just to bring money back to Pratt. He'd served in the Army Air Forces during World War II, worked as a ground crew mechanic at Salina Army Air Base, which meant that between 1943 and 1945, Earl Dunnigan had his hands inside engines for 8 to 14 hours a day. Radial engines, inline engines, the temperamental magnificent R2800 double wasp that powered the B-26 Marauder. He learned from men who had been trained by other men who could not afford to be wrong. In that world, a misdiagnosed engine problem didn't mean a delayed harvest. It meant a crew of 10 men didn't come home. After the war, Earl came back to Kansas, married a woman named Loretta Briggs from Nickerson, bought his first 80 acres on a GI loan, and began the slow, methodical process of building something that would last. Let me pause here and ask you something because it matters for understanding the man. How many people do you know who have done something every day for 40 years and never once stopped studying it? Not just doing it, studying it. Earl Dunnigan read every service bulletin Allis-Chalmers published for his equipment. He subscribed to Farm Journal and Successful Farming, and a technical publication out of Fargo that most people had never heard of. He kept handwritten notebooks, spiral-bound, the kind you bought at the dime store, filled with observations about his machines, dates, symptoms, what he tried, what worked, what didn't. By 1978, he had 11 of those notebooks in a cigar box on his workbench. His neighbors respected him. They did not always understand him. He was not a man who talked much about what he knew. He answered questions directly and without embellishment, and if he didn't know something, he said so plainly, which was considered a mild social eccentricity in a part of the country where men sometimes preferred a confident wrong answer to an honest admission of uncertainty. He had a daughter in Wichita and a son who'd gone to Colorado. Loretta had passed in 1971 from a cancer that moved fast. Earl had kept farming because farming was what there was and because the land doesn't wait for grief. He stood in his field now, watching his wheat bend in the morning wind, and he had not yet opened the hood of the Gleaner K. He was thinking. Wade Pritchard arrived at approximately 10 o'clock that Tuesday morning, and he arrived the way he always arrived anywhere, with confidence slightly in excess of what the situation required. Wade Pritchard was 41 years old, the son of a successful implement dealer who had expanded his father's single-lot John Deere dealership in Hutchinson into a 3-location operation stretching from Pratt to McPherson. He drove a 1978 Ford F-250 in a particular shade of green that matched the John Deere color scheme close enough to be intentional. He wore a pressed Western shirt even in August. His belt buckle was the size of a playing card. Wade was not a stupid man, that would be too simple. He was, in fact, reasonably intelligent, reasonably competent in the mechanics of modern farm equipment, and genuinely successful by any conventional measure. His dealership moved more John Deere iron in south-central Kansas than almost any other independent operation in the region. He knew his business. What Wade Pritchard lacked was the particular form of humility that comes only from having been wrong about something important, publicly, with consequences. He had been lucky enough, or careful enough, or perhaps just connected enough, to have avoided that experience so far in his life, and the absence of it had calcified in him into a certainty about the world that wore the costume of expertise. He had no great opinion of Earl Dunnigan. This was not personal animosity so much as categorical dismissal. Earl was old school. Earl ran old equipment. Earl had famously never bought so much as a spark plug from a Pritchard dealership, preferring to source his parts through a small independent supplier in Wichita or to manufacture substitutes himself in his machine shed. To Wade Pritchard, a man who didn't buy from you was a man who didn't understand value, and a man who ran a used 1972 Gleaner K instead of a current model John Deere 6600 was, at some level, a man who had already lost the argument. He had come this Tuesday morning not because Earl had called him. Earl had not called him. He had come because Dale Fosker, who farmed the half-section adjacent to Earl's and was a Pritchard customer, had called Wade's dealership that morning to mention that Earl Dunnigan was having combined trouble, and wasn't it something, and wasn't that a shame, right at harvest. Wade had decided to come see for himself. He told himself it was neighborly. It may have even been true, partially. But there was something else in it, the particular pleasure of watching a man who has declined your advice encounter the consequences of that declining. He parked his truck at the edge of the field, stepped out, looked at the orange machine sitting still and silent in the morning heat, and smiled. It was not a cruel smile, exactly, just the smile of a man who already knows the punchline. By 10:15, there were 7 vehicles parked along the fence line of Earl Dunnigan's field. Word travels at a particular velocity in a farming community in crisis, faster than almost anywhere else and with its own specific gravity. By mid-morning, 3 of Earl's nearest neighbors had come by, Dale Fosker as mentioned, plus the Heller brothers from the next road over, and a retired farmer named Bud Schwartz who had nothing better to do and never missed anything worth watching. Two representatives from the Hutchinson grain elevator had also appeared, ostensibly to check in on the situation, though Earl had not invited them either. And then there was Wade Pritchard, leaning against the hood of his F-250 with his arms folded, doing the thing some men do at other men's troubles, which is to observe them with a kind of theatrical sympathy that is barely distinguishable from satisfaction. The third engineer, the young man with the clipboard, had been and gone before most of the observers arrived. He had left no diagnosis. He had left no bill, which was perhaps the most honest thing about the visit. Earl was standing beside the Gleaner K. He hadn't opened the hood yet. He'd been walking around the machine slowly, the way a doctor might walk around a patient before touching them. His hands were in his pockets. Wade Pritchard pushed off his truck and walked over. "Earl," he said. "Wade. Hell of a morning to have combined trouble." Earl looked at the sky. "It is." There was a pause. Somewhere in the wheat, a meadowlark sang 3 notes. "3 engineers couldn't figure it out, I hear," Wade said. He kept his voice even, but there was a quality in it, just a vibration, like a string tuned slightly too tight. "That's correct," Earl said. "Allis-Chalmers send anybody from Topeka." "They did." Wade nodded slowly, looking at the machine. "Earl, I say this as a neighbor. You know I've got a 6600 I could have over here in 2 hours. Brand new, full warranty. I could have you cutting wheat by 1 o'clock. He paused, then added like an afterthought, "Rental rates reasonable, given the circumstances." Dale Fosker laughed from somewhere near the fence. Not unkindly, exactly, just the laugh of a man enjoying the theater. "I appreciate it," Earl said, and his voice carried absolutely nothing, no anger, no embarrassment, no gratitude that wasn't entirely sincere. "I'll let you know." Wade smiled. "That machine's 15 years old in its design, Earl. Parts are going to get harder to find. Engineers don't know it like they used to." He tilted his head at the Gleaner K. "Maybe it's telling you something." Now here is the moment that the people standing at that fence line would talk about for a long time afterward. Not what was said next, but what wasn't said. Earl Dunnigan looked at Wade Pritchard for exactly 3 seconds. Not a hostile look, not a wounded look, the look of a man doing arithmetic on information he already has. Then he turned and walked to his machine shed. He came back 4 minutes later carrying a coffee can, a small wooden box that had once held veterinary supplies, and his most recent spiral-bound notebook, number 11 in the series, half filled with his precise, unhurried handwriting. Bud Schwartz, who was 81 years old and had seen a great many things in his life, said afterward that he knew, in that moment, exactly what was about to happen. "Earl had that look," Bud said. "Earl had that look like a man who's been waiting for everyone else to finish talking." "You figure you can fix it yourself," Wade Pritchard said. There was nothing hiding in his voice now. It was in the open, the amusement, the certainty that this was going to go a particular way. "Earl, I respect you, but 3 certified engineers just walked off that field." Earl opened his notebook to a page near the middle. "They did," he said. "Let's see what they missed. Let me pause here and ask you something, because this is the heart of everything. What is the difference between expertise and wisdom? Because we talk about them as if they're the same thing, as if enough credentials and enough training produce enough understanding. But there's a man in every generation, often quiet, often old, often driving equipment that younger men have already written off, who knows something that the system of formal expertise has not yet figured out how to teach. And the reason he knows it is not mystical. It is not luck. It is 40 years of paying attention to a specific thing in a specific way. Earl Dunnigan knew the Gleaner K the way he knew his own hands. The Gleaner K, produced by Allis-Chalmers between 1971 and 1975, was a machine with a complicated reputation. It was, by many measures, a superior harvester to its contemporaries. Its axial flow-adjacent thrashing geometry reduced grain damage. Its grain loss monitor, a relatively new feature at the time, gave experienced operators a tool that most competitors couldn't match. Its engine, an Allis-Chalmers 426 cubic inch 6-cylinder diesel, was robust and powerful and, when properly maintained, extraordinarily reliable. But the Gleaner K had a specific, known, and poorly documented sensitivity in its fuel system. Not a defect precisely, more like a characteristic. A personality trait that the machine had developed, the way old things develop personality traits, as a result of specific engineering decisions made years earlier under specific assumptions about how the machine would be operated and maintained. The issue centered on the injection pump, a Robert Bosch inline pump, model number MW6, calibrated to a specific timing sequence that interacted, under certain temperature and altitude conditions, with the behavior of the fuel return line in a way that created a vapor lock pattern unlike anything in the standard diagnostic protocol. Earl had encountered this problem once before, not on this machine, on a neighbor's Gleaner K in the summer of 1976 on a 101-degree afternoon outside of Pretty Prairie. He had spent 2 hours diagnosing it. He had then spent 3 days writing 7 pages of notes about it. He had then written a letter by hand on lined paper to the Allis-Chalmers Technical Service Department in Milwaukee, describing what he had found. He had received, 4 weeks later, a form letter thanking him for his feedback. The letter was in his cigar box. Now here is what the 3 engineers had missed, and why they had missed it. The standard diagnostic protocol for a no-start condition on a diesel combine begins with fuel delivery, moves to compression, and then typically proceeds to the electrical system. It is a logical sequence. It is taught in every agricultural mechanics program in the country. But the Gleaner K's vapor lock pattern did not present the way a standard fuel delivery failure presents. It produced fuel pressure readings in the normal range at the pump, which caused every diagnostic sequence to move past fuel delivery to compression, where everything was also fine, and then to electrical, where everything was also fine. The engineers were finding no fault because they were looking in the right places in the wrong order. What Earl knew, what was in notebook number 11, page 43, written in his small, precise handwriting, was that the vapor lock in this specific fuel system occurred not at the pump, but at a 2-inch section of the return line where it passed within 4 inches of the exhaust manifold on the right side of the engine block. Under specific conditions, high ambient temperature, combined with a machine that had been sitting overnight after running hot, combined with a particular batch of number 2 diesel with a lower than average vapor pressure, the fuel in that section of line would partially vaporize, creating a bubble that was invisible to standard pressure testing, but sufficient to prevent the injection sequence from completing. The fix was not expensive. The fix was not complicated. It required approximately 40 minutes, a specific sequence of manual priming that bypassed the return line restriction, and the temporary application of a wet rag to cool the section of line nearest the manifold while the priming sequence was completed. Earl Dunnigan had known this since 1976. He opened his notebook to page 43. The heat was building by 11 o'clock. The thermometer on the outside of Earl's machine shed an old Taylor advertising thermometer, the kind that hardware stores used to give away, read 97 degrees. The southwest wind had dropped to almost nothing, which was its own kind of warning. When the wind stops in August in Kansas, it is usually gathering itself for something. Earl Dunnigan opened the hood of the Gleaner K with the particular ease of a man who has done it so many times that the motion is barely conscious. The engine compartment of a 1972 Gleaner K is not a small space, but it is a dense one. The 426 cubic inch 6-cylinder sits low and heavy, surrounded by the secondary system's fuel hydraulic cooling, in a configuration that rewards familiarity and punishes impatience. To someone who doesn't know it, it looks like organized chaos. To Earl, it looked like a sentence he had read many times and could finish from memory. He did not reach for anything immediately. He stood and looked at the engine for a long moment, the way he'd looked at the machine from outside. Then he reached into the coffee can. It contained, among other things, several clean rags, a small hand pump, and a piece of copper wire, and withdrew one of the rags. He dipped it in a bucket of water that he'd brought from the machine shed without anyone quite noticing, and he laid it carefully along a section of fuel return line on the right side of the engine block. Wade Pritchard, who had come close enough to observe, watched this. "What's he doing?" he said quietly to Dale Fosker. Dale Fosker didn't answer because he didn't know. Earl worked without explanation. He located the manual priming port on the injection pump, a small, easily overlooked fitting that the service manual mentioned in one sentence in a footnote on page 212, and attached the small hand pump from the coffee can. He began priming slowly with a rhythm that suggested he was counting something in his head. After approximately 90 seconds of this, he paused, checked the wet rag on the return line, added a small amount of additional water from the bucket, and resumed priming. Bud Schwartz, who had been watching from a respectful distance, moved slightly closer. He recognized something in the way Earl was moving. He had seen men work on machinery for 70 years, and he knew the difference between a man trying something and a man doing something. The Heller brothers were at the fence talking quietly. One of them said something about it being too hot and heading home. The other one stayed. Earl completed the priming sequence. He withdrew the hand pump, replaced the fitting cap, and reached into the wooden box for a small wrench, a 3/8-inch combination wrench that he had ground to a custom profile years ago to fit a specific fastener on this specific machine. He made a single adjustment to the bleed fitting on the secondary fuel filter housing. A small amount of diesel ran down the side of the engine block and dripped into the dust below. He replaced the wrench. He looked at the engine for 3 more seconds. Then he climbed up into the cab of the Gleaner K. The cab of a 1972 Gleaner K smells on a hot August morning like old rubber and diesel and the particular sweet dust smell that wheat chaff leaves on every surface after years of harvest. The seat, a worn brown vinyl, was cracked along the right bolster in a pattern Earl knew by touch. The sun through the side glass was hot on his left arm. He adjusted the throttle to the correct starting position, not full, not low, the specific middle position that the Gleaner K preferred, and he turned the key. The starter engaged. Now, let me be precise about what happened next, because precision matters here. The engine did not roar to life instantly. It turned over 3 times, the starter grinding with that particular diesel rhythm, compression heavy and deliberate, and on the 4th compression stroke, fuel reached the injectors in the correct sequence, at the correct pressure in the correct volume, for the first time since the machine had been shut down 2 days before. The Gleaner K fired. Not a sputter, not a tentative cough. It fired all 6 cylinders in sequence and settled into the low, authoritative idle that a properly running 426 cubic inch diesel produces, which is a sound like a very large, very confident heartbeat. The exhaust pipe on the right side of the machine produced one dark puff, the signature of a diesel clearing its throat after rest, and then ran clear. Earl let it idle for 60 seconds. He checked the gauges, oil pressure normal, water temperature beginning to rise toward operating range, fuel pressure normal at last. He let it idle for another 60 seconds. The wheat in the field in front of him moved in a small returning breeze. A half-mile away, at the horizon, a cloud was beginning to build. He engaged the header drive. The cutting platform, a 20-foot header, a Model 300 grain platform with a worn but functional auger, began to rotate. The sound changed, the clean diesel heartbeat now accompanied by the mechanical rhythm of the harvesting system, a sound like a large and purposeful machine doing exactly what it was built to do. Earl Dunnigan drove the Gleaner K out of its position and into the edge of the wheat field. He made one pass. Then he made another. 7 people were standing along the fence line of Earl Dunnigan's field on that Tuesday morning, and the silence that fell among them when that combine fired and moved into the wheat was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of something settling. Wade Pritchard stood at the fence with his arms no longer folded. His left hand was on the top fence rail. He was watching the orange machine move through the golden wheat, the header cutting and the grain flowing up the elevator, and the whole 400-bushel system operating with the smooth, untroubled efficiency of a machine that had simply been waiting to be understood correctly. He didn't say anything. Dale Fosker, to his credit, took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and put it back. That was all. The Heller brother who had stayed looked at the Heller brother who had started to leave and had come back when he heard the engine fire. Neither of them said anything either. Bud Schwartz said one word, under his breath, not intended for anyone. The word was there. As in, there it is. As in, that's the thing I was waiting to see. What Wade Pritchard did next says something important about the man, and I want to be fair to him here. He did not leave. He could have gotten in his F-250 and driven back to Hutchinson, and no one would have blamed him for it, and the story might have ended differently. Instead, he stood at that fence for another 20 minutes, watching Earl work. And then he walked to the machine shed where he knew Earl kept a water jug, poured himself a cup, sat down on an old cinder block, and thought about something. What he was thinking about he would not say for several years. When he finally did say it to his son, who would relay it to others, it was this: "I was thinking about how long that man must have been watching that machine, and I was thinking about what I'd missed by deciding I already knew the answer." It is not a comfortable thought. It is the kind of thought that a man who has built his life on being the expert in the room does not come to easily. But Wade Pritchard sat on that cinder block in the August heat of Reno County, Kansas, and had it. The cloud on the horizon was growing, the weather front was moving, the wheat was going in. By 12:30, Earl Dunnigan had cut 40 acres. By the time the first real wind arrived at 4 in the afternoon, carrying with it the smell of distant rain, that iron and dust smell that every Kansas farmer knows in their blood, he had cut 160 acres, and the Gleaner K had not missed a stroke. He brought the grain in before the rain. All of it. The harvest of 1978 was, for Earl Dunnigan, his best yield in 12 years of farming that ground. Final numbers: 42 bushels to the acre, 412 acres at $2.96 a bushel. Gross receipts of approximately $51,000, more money than Earl had seen from a single crop since he started farming his current acreage. He paid off the last of a small equipment note that fall. He bought a new water heater for the farmhouse. He replaced the worn auger flighting on the Gleaner K header and sent the injection pump to a specialist in Wichita for a full calibration, not because it needed it strictly, but because Earl was the kind of man who addressed the thing that had nearly gone wrong before it actually went wrong. He wrote 4 more pages in notebook number 11 about the fuel system diagnosis, including the specific ambient temperature threshold above which the vapor lock condition became likely, the exact priming sequence timing he had used, and a note about the grade of diesel that seemed most prone to the problem. He wrote it in the same small, unhurried handwriting, as if he were taking notes for someone who might need them someday. He was, in fact, taking notes for someone who might need them someday. He just didn't know who yet. Word of what had happened on Earl's field on that August Tuesday moved through Reno County in the way that genuinely surprising things move slowly at first, then all at once, as if people needed time to decide whether the story was as remarkable as it seemed before committing to telling it. By late September, 3 different farmers had called Earl to ask about the Gleaner K fuel system. He answered each call patiently and in full detail, without any suggestion that the knowledge was proprietary or that their calling him was anything other than a reasonable thing to do. One of those farmers, a man named Gary Engel who ran 600 acres over near Buhler, followed Earl's advice, fixed the same problem on his own Gleaner K, and saved a harvest that had been 2 days from being lost. He sent Earl a case of Stroh's beer and a handwritten note. Earl kept the note in the cigar box with the letter from Allis-Chalmers. Wade Pritchard did not return to Earl's farm that fall, but the following spring, April of 1979, just before planting, he pulled his F-250 down Spinner Road and knocked on Earl's door. Loretta wasn't there to answer it, hadn't been for 8 years, but Earl came to the door in his work clothes with grease on one hand, and listened while Wade Pritchard said that he'd been thinking about what happened in August and wondered if Earl would be willing to come look at a fuel system problem on a machine at his shop in Hutchinson that 2 of his own mechanics hadn't been able to diagnose. Earl said he'd come Thursday. He came Thursday. He diagnosed the problem in 40 minutes. He charged nothing. Wade offered to pay. Earl said no, he appreciated the coffee. There is something in that exchange that resists easy categorization. It was not a dramatic reconciliation. It was not a scene from a movie. It was 2 men, one of whom had been wrong about something important, finding a way to be useful to each other. In the context of a farming community, that is its own kind of resolution. Wade Pritchard's son, a man named Kevin Pritchard who now runs the family dealership operation, expanded now to 5 locations, tells this story at industry dinners when the subject of expertise and experience comes up. He was 11 years old in 1978 and was not at Earl's field that day, but he heard about it enough times from enough different people that it became part of the way he thought about what it means to know something. Earl Dunnigan farmed his 412 acres until 1989, when a second knee surgery made full-time operation impractical. He sold the land to a neighboring operation, not to a corporate buyer, not to a land investment company, but to a young couple from Pratt who reminded him. He told people of himself and Loretta in 1948. He sold them the Gleaner K with it, along with the 11 spiral notebooks in the cigar box. He told the young man, his name was Travis Kemper, that the notebooks were worth more than the machine. Travis Kemper, who is still farming that ground today, has confirmed that this was true. Earl Dunnigan passed away in March of 1993 at the age of 77 in a hospital in Hutchinson. His daughter drove down from Wichita. His son came from Colorado. The obituary in the Hutchinson News described him as a farmer and veteran. It mentioned his service in the Army Air Forces and the number of years he had worked his land. It did not mention the Gleaner K. Some things get preserved in official records. Other things get preserved in the memories of people who were standing at a fence line on a hot August morning, watching a man who never stopped studying something apply 60 years of honest attention to a problem that 3 certified engineers had walked away from. Both kinds of preservation matter. This story is an attempt at the second kind. Let me tell you what I think this story is actually about, because it would be easy and not entirely wrong to say it's about an old farmer showing up the experts. There's a version of this story that's just a satisfaction machine where the underdog wins and the arrogant man is humbled and everyone goes home happy. And there is some of that in here, I won't pretend otherwise. But I think what this story is really about is the cost of deciding you already know the answer. The 3 engineers who came to Earl Dunnigan's field that August were not bad engineers. They were in all likelihood competent and trained and working from the best diagnostic protocols they'd been given. What they lacked was not ability. What they lacked was Earl's specific knowledge of this specific machine in this specific context, knowledge that could only be built the way Earl had built it, slowly, personally, over years of paying careful attention to one particular thing. And Wade Pritchard, who was not a villain in any deep sense, who was a smart man and a successful one, had made the mistake that success sometimes teaches people to make. He had decided somewhere along the way that knowing the category of a thing meant understanding the thing. He knew combines, therefore he knew what Earl's problem was. He knew old equipment, therefore he knew what Earl should do. He had stopped asking questions because he had already arrived at answers. There is a quote attributed to various sources, debated by scholars, but true in the way that useful things are true, that the beginner sees many possibilities and the expert sees few. Earl Dunnigan, with 60 years of farming and 20 years of specific engagement with one line of machinery, had somehow preserved the beginner's quality of looking. He had not stopped asking. He had not stopped writing things down. He had not decided that what he already knew was sufficient. That is rarer than it sounds. Let me pause here and ask you something, and I want you to actually sit with this one. Is there something in your life, a relationship, a skill, a problem you face regularly that you have stopped actually looking at because you have decided you already know it, because you've been there before and you know how it goes, because the answer feels obvious? Earl Dunnigan's 11 notebooks were not the work of a man who thought he had all the answers. They were the work of a man who knew that attention is not a gift you receive once and keep forever. It is something you practice daily, in the heat, when you're tired, when the wheat is dying and the weather front is building and 3 engineers have just walked off your field. The Gleaner K that Earl fixed that day is still in existence. Travis Kemper has it in a storage shed on the old Dunnigan ground, southeast of Nickerson, down that gravel road that doesn't appear on any official map. He doesn't use it to harvest. His operation runs newer iron now, as it has to. But he keeps it, partly for sentimental reasons and partly because something in him recognizes that a machine which survived 60 years and 3 certified engineers and one August morning in Kansas and kept cutting wheat through a building thunderstorm deserves to be kept. The notebooks are in a fireproof box in his house. He has read them, all 11. And here, at the end of this story, is the thing that Earl Dunnigan seemed to have always known, without ever saying it in so many words. Old things are not old because they failed. Old things are old because they lasted. And the knowledge of how to keep them running, real knowledge, earned knowledge, the kind that lives in a spiral notebook in a cigar box on a workbench, is not less valuable because it is not official. It is more valuable because it is true. The wheat comes in, the weather comes through, the machine runs or it doesn't. And somewhere in a county in Kansas, a young farmer is reading a dead man's handwriting and learning something that 3 engineers missed. That's not nothing. That's everything. This story is set in Reno County, Kansas, 1978. The Gleaner Model K combined 1971-1975. the Allis-Chalmers 426 cubic inch diesel engine, the Robert Bosch MW6 inline injection pump, grain prices of $2.96 bushel in the 1978 Kansas harvest market, the Hutchinson grain elevator system, and stem rust conditions of that era are based on historical record. Earl Dunnigan, Wade Pritchard, Loretta Dunnigan, Dale Fosker, Bud Schwartz, Gary Engel, Travis Kemper, and all dialogue are fictional and dramatized for storytelling purposes. If you know someone who could fix anything with their hands and never said a word about it, this one was for them. Subscribe to The Forgotten Farmer. We tell the stories history forgot to write down.